Greetings. When thinking of North Korea, the common image that come to mind globally are its nuclear and missile programs. North Korea has often been labeled a rogue state due to its continuous nuclear weapon tests and missile launches. Moreover, it has recently dispatched troops more than 10,000 strong in Ukraine-Russia war. This month, we will take the time to examine North Korea's military capacity and actions from regional and global strategic perspectives. First, Professor Philip Baxter from Madison University will discuss the people and organizations behind North Korea's nuclear weapons and the network involved in their development. Professor Lauren Sukin from the London School of Economics and Political Science will introduce interactions between North Korea's military activities and rhetorical threats to our informed audience. Ankit Pandanen, a research fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, will delve into the development and current status of North Korean missile technologies, which are essential for its nuclear weapons capacity. Deputy Director of Russia and Eurasia Program and Head of Ukraine Forum of Chatham House in the United Kingdom, Orysia Lutsevychga, will explain the impact of North Korea's dispatch of troops in the Ukraine-Russia war. She argues that the global geostrategic transformation is happening because of North Korea, a phenomenon that I myself label the security convergence between Europe and East Asia. All right, Dr. Baxter, and then you have 15 minutes, and then I think it's after that, we will have a short Q&A discussion session. Okay, it's all yours.
Thank you for the invitation. My name is Philip Baxter. I'm an assistant professor with Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And this research looks at the kind of nuclear related networks within North Korea and looks at both the international collaborations as well as the domestic collaborations, kind of visualizing and mapping out the ecosystem and organizations that exist to support the tacit knowledge or the kind of the hard to gain knowledge related to the nuclear fuel cycle. So that includes information such as computer science or concrete engineering, not just kind of nuclear physics, but all of the things that would support a nuclear industry. So this was done in collaboration with several authors here on my slides and with the support of the Korea Foundation. So in this presentation, I'm going to look at kind of what are these ecosystems, how are they organized? What are the kind of differences between international and domestic? How do they kind of organize themselves? How do they function? What are some of the key characteristics around the North Korean nuclear sector, especially as it relates to nuclear weapons? So as you can see on this next slide, hopefully, there we are. This is kind of the key motivating question my colleagues and I undertook, was looking at how has North Korea attempted to acquire intangible technology, right? So not just seeking out centrifuges or equipment, but how has it learned the science around nuclear weapons, around the physics needed for nuclear weapons, the material science needed for conducting enrichment or plutonium extraction? How has it kind of looked at that? And what we found were kind of focusing in on the international side on collaboration was that the strategy for acquiring intangible technology, so acquiring tacit knowledge, experience, is very similar to how North Korea has acquired its actual hard technology, right? They focused on collaborations that vary in geographic scope. They're able to obfuscate their intentions when engaging internationally. They generally look to kind of develop an international or a core group of individuals that work within North Korea and then send out individuals to work in other geographic locations to acquire and then come back and assimilate technology. So the way we did this from a network science perspective is that we collected all of the publications, which are demonstrations of tacit knowledge, that relate to the nuclear fuel cycle that are published that include North Koreans as part of the publishing team. And so this drew roughly 1,300 articles that involved international partners as well as roughly 1,400 that included domestic-only publications. And we kept our timeline from 1974 to 2018 and collected all the publications that we could find on such as radiation, isotopic separation, physics, chemistry, all of the different technologies necessary. So it was a very broad outlook. And then what we did was we looked at the different networks that were derived from these. So how are people partnering? What institutions are there to kind of serve as hubs of learning? What sort of technical expertise is the focus? Are they focusing on isotope enrichment in this phase, or are they focusing on mathematics and computer science in this phase? And so also, what countries are they are they engaged in, right? Are they working mainly with European countries, mainly with China, mainly domestically? How has this changed and shifted? And we looked at three different distinct periods. We looked at a pre-agreed framework period, so 1974 to 1994. We looked at this then up until the their first nuclear test in 2006, and then kind of 2007 to 2018 once they've had a fully robust program. And so what do these different stages like? Are they acquiring different technology? How has that changed? So we'll start with the international collaboration. And what we saw was that at the earliest stages of North Korea's nuclear program, there is a very little international collaboration, or very select countries that they engage with. And you can kind of see here on the left graphic, it's primarily with European countries, but with some Chinese organizations as well. So it's not a very robust collaborative network. So much of the network is focused in on internal development, but there are a few connections between engineering and physics, which suggests that North Korea is not at this point able to link teams doing research on related topics with the kind of engineering and physics core. So it's very, think about it, dispersed, still very much developing in this phase, with a focus more on European engagement rather than more domestic or Chinese engagement. This is very different in the post-pre-agreement period in the run-up to the first nuclear test, where we see North Korea shift primarily towards post or communist bloc countries, specifically Chinese, China, and then a few others such as Poland and other countries in Europe, but for the most part, only those old communist bloc countries. So here, also the topics North Korean researchers collaborated with international researchers changed substantially. So they start doing very repeated connections with Chinese researchers, particularly on physics and material science. So as these relationships start to get stronger, you start to develop more tacit knowledge, right? So I always think of tacit knowledge development, the example of if I write a paper with someone else, we both share in that tacit knowledge, right? We've both done that together. We both understand what's happening. If I do a paper with somebody that's, say, in South Korea, the tacit knowledge may not be as robustly transferred if I am not in South Korea as well, right? Because we're exchanging notes, we're not in the same space. And so what we see is a lot more engagement with North Korean scientists being co-located with Chinese scientists. So sharing, not just having affiliations with North Korean institutions, but actually publishing out of Chinese organizations. And so this is the kind of a really dramatic shift in how they seek to acquire nuclear technology and develop their nuclear ecosystem. Shifts from, well, we're going to go out and just place people kind of where we want, to embedding individuals in organizations for a period of time and then bringing them back. And then finally, we have in 2007, a dramatic increase in publications coming out of North Korea, even controlling for the internet and whatnot. We still see a rapid development of these. And we can see that these technologies have shifted a bit. Most of the engagement is exclusively with China at this point, some German collaboration, and the technologies have also shifted. The technologies are much more diverse. You see a lot more engagements on things that you would not have seen earlier into in the program, such as mathematics, isotopes separation, computer science. The focus here is not just on or on topics that you need for once you've acquired a weapon to kind of ensure that you can run simulations on testing, that you can further out the way that you acquire nuclear materials. And so we see kind of a distinct effort to just acquire knowledge, but to diversify in areas that are needed. So much more working in dual use areas as well. So as the UN, the United States, and others start to put sanctions onto North Korea, you see a shift away from the physics and more into areas that could be considered dual use: chemistry, material science, and so forth. In terms of individual researchers and international connections, it was a very interesting finding. Was we looked at 61 North Korean researchers who started publishing domestically, but only 17 later published international journals. So what we could take away from all of the researchers that we looked at was that if individuals started publishing in North Korea, is that they were generally would stay in North Korea and not begin to publish external to North Korea. So what we see are younger individuals being sent abroad to acquire experience and technology and whatnot, and then brought back and integrated into the network. And then they don't go back out, right? So it's much more sending folks out, say maybe dissertation or whatnot, and then bringing them back. But there's no further exchange out. So it's a very only small number of individuals within North Korea's ecosystem that are able to kind of continue those relationships of international collaboration and bringing individuals and tacit knowledge back within North Korea. These these individuals also focus more on dual use technology rather than on topics that would say raise red flags for the international community with regards to nuclear weapons. In terms of where are the key institutions, the Department of Energy Science, Kim Il-sung University, is the primary hub for knowledge and for organizing of international collaboration within North Korea. We could see in some of the previous graphs, if you scroll back, you can see in some of those organizations you can see are listed in this green. We've highlighted the ones that are important for hosting and collaborating with North Korea. Primarily, you'll see Kim Il-sung University as well as some other Chinese universities, but not a lot within North Korea in terms of within their nuclear sector doing this work. Additionally, research who shifted from domestic journals to international journals in collaboration with foreign researchers had a lower median time between domestic and international journal publication. So in terms of domestic network structure, I just have a few graphs here keeping the same schedule of how arrangements. Pre-agreed framework. Now this is focusing just on research being done within North Korea during this period. And you can see that it focuses primarily on nuclear research, generalized radiation research, isotope separation, chemistry, material science. These are the topics that are necessary at the outset of a program to start to develop the basis for, understanding the nuclear fuel cycle for extracting plutonium from spent fuel and so forth. So this is not uncharacteristics of all nuclear programs. Having looked at these networks across globally, across all countries that have proliferated, this is similar to all of their structures and should not raise red flags. And you can see that in kind of the focus of where the technology is on engineering, physics, plasma science, all understandably a focus for those countries that would want to seek out nuclear weapons. The second period, we can see a much greater collaboration domestically within radiation isotope separation and nuclear studies. I would say that this and no presence of technologies related to enrichment. So And this kind of aligns with how how North Korea sought out its nuclear material. Is that during this period we could see a dramatic shift into collaborations related to isotope separation and the technologies related to that field, right? In the final phase, we continue to see an expansion of these fields, and I would say that there's much greater collaboration within North Korean domestic networks than initially anticipated, or rather, that there are cross-topical discussions more than we've seen in other countries. That said, most of the networks related to kind of nuclear research are not robust like 20, 30 person teams. They're typically 2 to 3 authors on a paper. They typically have one person that is the foundation who kind of is the organization or the pivot point by which most of the research is done. And that's it. So there's not a big spirit of, hey, let's have everyone involved in the lab. It's more focused on 1 or 2 individuals publishing and the rest of the team, or if there is a team, not having their names on papers, not having that tacit knowledge kind of identified. So that is for those. These are just domestic. In terms of conclusions and implications in kind of the nuclear-rated ecosystem, North Korea continues to be kind of a siloed research community. While there is some cross-pollination in research domains, most of the teams, like I said, are small. Individuals that do leave the country and are published generally don't publish as much when they return to North Korea. That said, there is a greater publication. There are more connections, so a greater tacit knowledge base is being created. The strategies used by North Korea to kind of establish these networks and to develop their tacit knowledge has shifted over time, and that is in response to kind of the sanctions that have been put in place and other efforts by the international community to start to attempt to stop their progress. They continue to obfuscate where possible the nature of North Korean involvement in research. An example of this would be an individual that identified as a North Korean publishing as a Chinese affiliated author, but without providing North Korean affiliations, and also changing their name slightly to mask their identity. That is one strategy. They're also embedding the research more directly into relevant strategic topics of research collaboration and more in fields that are a bit more generalized, so the dual use fields, rather than focusing on, say, enrichment or plutonium extraction technologies. It's more material science as related. So I will go ahead and stop there, and I would like to thank you for your time.
Well, I mean, I think this is a pretty interesting, findings from the academic and policy perspective, and I think it's so the evolution of North Korean nuclear science research and then development, it's pretty amazing. And then it's as far as I understand, North Korea actually tried to get a lot of technology transfer in the form of human exchange from the very beginning. But I think it was very interesting that those young scholars from North Korea to go to mainly in the People's Republic of China and get some knowledge, and then cutting edge technologies, and then going back to North Korea and then never come out.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. So
yeah. For other countries, yeah, you see an individual that will move to a country, do dissertation work or other research, come back to that country, publish there, and then do other move elsewhere, or be affiliated with organizations that are in other countries. Here we don't see this much, and North Korea attempted to kind of purchase other technology, other like schematics and other things, but really focused on Europe at the beginning of where they would acquire their knowledge through those international partnerships and whatnot. And after that period, after the agreed framework, those kind of dried up. They really focused in on, okay, we're going to build domestically our knowledge and then send out individuals to China on a much smaller, kind of more targeted basis.
Can you tell me, who are North Korean nuclear engineers and then scholars, and how do they work together? And then is it even possible, to
Oh no, yeah, we have a list somewhere. With this, I didn't put this in the slides. Happy to share with, but no, we
How
have
many of them?
lists. There's roughly, I would say, 400, I think, on our
Oh.
list, ranked and using network science, we're able to rank,
Mm.
who is the most important person
Mm, mm,
in the network based on different metrics. So who serves
mm,
as a bridge between
mm,
different technologies, what maybe say those working on material science and those working on implosion physics, right? And who's the person working between those groups? What was interesting with North Korea is they don't have those individuals. We see very much clusters of individuals that work in one technology, others work in other technologies, and where there is some overlap, they're
mm.
there, but not like we see in other countries. They're very much siloed into their specific
Mm,
technologies. So you look at all the individuals, their betweenness score is what
mm,
is the measure, is
mm.
very low because they're not connecting these dispersed groups.
I think it's in a sense, from the objective perspective, and it's pretty amazing, for these North Korean nuclear scientists and engineers to actually develop its own, nuclear weapon, which under the circumstances of, so-called, isolation, very limited or very low level of international exchange on the, nuclear science engineering. Yeah, I mean, recently, North Korea and Russia actually have pseudo alliance treaty, and then that was publicized widely, and then concerning many watchers of Korean Peninsula and North Korean nuclear politics, and I mean, based upon what you researched for from this academic international and domestic epistemic community or
Mhm.
network on the nuclear technology and development. What kind of technologies does North Korea can the get from Russia counterpart? And then I think it's you have been working on this politics of technology of nuclear weapons. So there are many areas North Korea direly need
Mhm.
to get. I think it's Russia actually at least expressed the willingness to share the technology with North Korea. What are the primary the dimensions of this nuclear technology from Russia to North Korea?
Yeah, I would say so. It's really interesting how North Korea has developed its nuclear program over time. In that, Russia was one of the first to help it develop nuclear infrastructure back in the 50s and 60s. First to help develop that technology, but it kind of took a step back, and China then stepped in. And then as China or as North Korea kind of moved forward with its nuclear program, China really was seen as distancing itself from North Korea a bit in many regards. However, not on the technology exchange, which is
Mm,
interesting, right? You don't see a drop off in individuals co-publishing with those in China, and so that's kind of an interesting, like, okay, yeah, we're gonna push back a little bit on North Korea from a political side, but not on the technology side.
mm,
And I think in
mm,
terms of kind of technology exchange with Russia moving forward, we're seeing a lot with regards
mm,
to North Korean sale of technology to Russia for its war in Ukraine.
mm,
But we're not seeing as much in collaboration on the science side. If there was going to be more of that, I would say it's probably going to be on the safe handling, building
mm,
in what's called
mm,
PALS systems,
mm,
so passive controls for their nuclear weapons. That's something that we've worked with other countries. The United States, the United
mm.
States has worked with other countries that have sought out nuclear weapons.
That's right.
Is okay, yeah, you have their weapons. We acknowledge that, but we are going
Mm,
to help you integrate PALS systems in them so that they become more secure
mm,
in them. So that's something that I believe there's the not classified information. Believe the U.S. did that with Pakistan in
mm.
the 2000s.
I think it's you explained about this evolution or formation of the nuclear science R&D ecosystem in North
Mhm.
Korea. Do you think it will be sustainable, for foreseeable future?
Yeah, as an authoritative government, it's very interesting to see that they even got this far. We look at, say, the case of Iran. Iran was much slower than North Korea in its development.
Mm,
Its scientists were even more siloed than North Koreans, and the progress has been slower. Right, they've not built out the robust ecosystem. So if from a political perspective, if we start to see accidents, we start to see mishaps or a lack of development, perhaps that that class loses ground a bit. If they do, that's the loss of tacit knowledge. It'll take years to redevelop. I mean, the nuclear program for North Korea took almost 40 years. And so building up that tacit knowledge again would slow further development, further improvements. And what you worry about now is, they figured out how to enrich, they figured out how to extract plutonium, how to build the bomb. What we need now is to have safe, secure weapon systems. If you start to remove that tacit knowledge, that becomes more accident prone, right? That's one of the big concerns is accidental launch, mishaps, those sorts of things.
Okay, thank you so much.
No
and then
problem.
it was pretty intriguing, talk at the same time, the Q&A and the discussion session with you, Professor Philip Baxter. Thank you so much one more time.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you for accepting our invitation to give an online lecture. And then this is Professor Lauren Sukin in the LSE, and it's a great pleasure to have you on our program one more time. And then you have 15 minutes for talk, and then we will have 15 minutes Q&A session afterwards. Okay, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much for having me. Today, I'm going to be talking about the verbal threats that North Korea makes in relation to its nuclear security program. And we're going to think a little bit about how North Korea uses these threats to try to communicate information about their nuclear security. So I'm an assistant professor of international relations at the London School of Economics, primarily working on nuclear security issues. And I want to start out with a little bit of background on North Korea's nuclear program. This should likely be familiar to the audience, but just to set the scene, our current open source intelligence estimates suggest that North Korea's nuclear program contains around 30 to 60 nuclear warheads, and North Korea has increasingly been focused on developing tactical capabilities, so miniaturizing, lightening, and standardizing their nuclear weapons program. And North Korea has made threats about a rapid expansion of this program over the next couple of years. It remains to be seen how capable they actually are of fulfilling that, but it gives us a sense of what their goals are for development. Most of the focus that we see now on North Korea's nuclear program is not about expanding the number of weapons, but improving their existing delivery systems. So a keystone of North Korea's nuclear delivery system is its ICBM capabilities, which now are quite long range and able to strike anywhere in the continental United States, although there are still struggles with precision. North Korea has other types of delivery capabilities, including short and medium range missiles, as well as artillery, and is working on improving the success of these systems with solid fuel propellants, better satellite guidance, and improved in-flight maneuverability to try to address risks related to, for example, missile defense. And North Korea's nuclear arsenal has a quite unusual doctrine. North Korea has declared formally that its nuclear arsenal has an irreversible status, suggests their unwillingness to compromise on the persistence of the program. North Korea's doctrine argues that nuclear weapons are primarily used for defending the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and fundamental interests of the state. Now, this is not too different from other major nuclear states, but where the major doctrinal differences do appear are on the conditions under which North Korea claims it would be legitimate to use nuclear weapons. So, as is typical for all nuclear states, North Korea reserves a right to a nuclear second strike, meaning if North Korea were attacked with nuclear assets, it could retaliate in kind. But North Korea also has some more forward-leaning conditions for nuclear use, including an explicit condition around preemption, where North Korea argues if it perceives imminent and pending attacks on strategic assets, and especially the chain of command and control, that it might retaliate with nuclear weapons. And the reason to have this preemption clause is in part concerns about leadership decapitation. So this allows North Korea to argue that if key leaders were taken out, its nuclear weapons would come into play. North Korea has two conditions for the use of nuclear weapons in conventional warfare. One of these is taking initiative in crisis, a phrase that most scholars have interpreted to be about escalation dominance, that is, to maintain the flow of a conventional conflict and to try to decouple U.S. interests from South Korean interests if there were a high level of contestation. And finally, North Korea argues that it can use nuclear weapons in the event of a catastrophic crisis to the existence of the state. And this is similar to language in Russian nuclear doctrine about the use of nuclear weapons to preserve the vital interest and existence of the Russian state. And this phrasing suggests that North Korea is trying to deter large-scale conventional aggression and could potentially use these weapons if it felt like it was losing a conventional conflict. So now that we have some background information about what North Korea's capabilities are and what its doctrine is, we want to understand a little bit about what these threats to use nuclear weapons actually mean and how we might be able to understand when North Korea is seriously considering the use of nuclear weapons or other types of escalation. And so the project I'm going to be talking about today is research that I've done that tries to answer this question: should North Korea's nuclear threats be taken as cheap talk, or are they more serious signals of North Korea's intention? And the argument that I'll make here is that the individual threats we see coming from North Korea might not be individually meaningful. One single nuclear threat doesn't tell us that much information. But if we look in aggregate at patterns in these threats, then we can understand important elements of North Korea's strategic thinking. That is, the arguments, the ideas that come up frequently in North Korea's rhetoric tell us a little bit about where the strategic priorities lie, and we can look at patterns in the frequency of threats over time to predict and understand when North Korea will take provocative action. And the underlying idea here is that when North Korea makes threats, we can use that to predict when they'll take costly or risky behaviors, such as testing new nuclear delivery systems or even nuclear weapons themselves. To do this, I'm going to look at threats coming from the North Korean regime. And so I'm going to collect English language articles from KCNA, a North Korean newspaper, back to the late 1990s. And this gives me a data set of about 124,000 documents of English language North Korean media, which are intended to signal to international audiences the idea with these English language publications. So they're going to be read by analysts abroad, and many of these are particularly targeted at an American audience. The closeness of KCNA with the regime tells us that there's some intentional communication going on here, although of course it's not a perfect relationship. And then we're going to look at how those affect provocations. So looking at cross-border military incidents, as well as nuclear provocations. So that's mostly nuclear tests and missile tests. To identify from those KCNA articles when North Korea makes threats, I use a machine learning technique that automatically processes the rhetoric and sorts it into various categories that come up frequently in North Korean media. One of these categories, which you see in the bottom in red, are instances where North Korea makes threats against its adversaries. But it talks about lots of other things, from economic conditions to North Korean ideology, and even culture, talking about things like festivals, sports, and schools. We can zoom here a little bit into the category from that topic model of threats that North Korea makes, and you can see some of the common words that characterize when North Korea is making threats. You see that many of these are aimed at the United States, but they also use militaristic language like nuclear, military, war, etc. So to validate that this method is actually identifying threats, I use a process where I assign articles to the topic that they most closely match, and then I randomly sample and hand code, so qualitatively, analytically read and analyze articles that my algorithm thinks are threats. And it turns out that 100% of the articles that are sampled that the machine learning process expected to be threats, in fact, contained threats. And so I have some examples of the types of threats that North Korea makes here. So we have an if-then type threat, such as even a single shell dropped on the Korean Peninsula might lead to the outbreak of a new world war, a thermonuclear war. And we also have implicit threats that are a little more vague or don't have specific trigger conditions, like this one. We consider the US no more than a lump which we can beat to a jelly anytime. So what triggers North Korean threats? I find two main topics that appear frequently in this rhetoric. The first has to do with joint military exercises. So just over a third of North Korea's threats speak about various joint military exercises, sometimes naming specific exercises, like you can see here, the reference to the Full Eagle and Freedom Guardian and Focus Lens series of exercises, whereas others may talk more generally about interoperability and exercises that occur primarily between South Korea and the United States, but also in response to more multilateral exercises that South Korea participates in. Almost half of the threats that North Korea makes are explicitly nuclear threats. So North Korea suggests that they'll use nuclear weapons, and they focus on areas of contestation that make their nuclear arsenal vulnerable. So one area that comes up quite frequently are North Korea's concerns about preemption and preventative action that the ROK or the United States could take. So, for example, almost 21% of North Korea's threats are in response to concerns about preventative action. And so we can see part of the core goal for North Korea's nuclear arsenal is to try to stave off these potentialities. So what does the rhetoric actually have to do with North Korea's behavior? Are these threats just empty threats, or do they tell us something about what North Korea is going to do? Well, I argue that North Korea makes many threats. In fact, my data finds that on average, North Korea makes 48 English language threats in KCNA every month. What I do find is that patterns in when these threats occur have a lot to do with what North Korea's actual behavior is. So we can see here a graph that on the x-axis shows us the distance from a provocation that has to do with nuclear weapons or nuclear delivery vehicles. And on the y-axis shows the mean number of articles in KCNA that day that would contain threats against North Korea's adversaries. And what this figure is showing us is that in the ramp-up period before provocative action, North Korea is increasingly likely to make a higher number of threats, and that those threats peak right before North Korea takes one of these provocative actions and then declines in response to that behavior. Now, the reason to do this is for North Korea to communicate to its adversaries that it's unhappy with the status quo, that there's some triggering factor that creates strategic anxiety in North Korea and may demand some sort of action to demonstrate resolve and try to, in the sort of American terminology, restore deterrence on the Korean Peninsula. So it's not just the case that these two patterns move together, that threats and provocations occur simultaneously, but also that these threats precede and therefore have a signaling component that has to do with patterns of provocations. So for example, we can use the number of articles that KCNA includes making threats per month to predict whether or not North Korea is going to engage in a nuclear-related provocation. So we see here on the x-axis the number of articles per month where North Korea makes threats, and on the y-axis, the likelihood that the month includes a provocation. You can see that as we get more and more articles coming out of KCNA that make threats, North Korea is increasingly likely, up to a sort of plateau point at above maybe 100 threats per month, North Korea is increasingly likely to engage in some sort of provocation. And so we can use these to help understand the behavior. It also tells us that North Korea isn't just sort of randomly or systematically using these threats to try to change the information environment. There is also some intentionality behind this behavior. We can use a similar approach using regression analysis to predict not just the concurrency of threats and provocations, but also the linear pattern of behavior. And so we can see, for example, that threats predict not only whether a provocation will occur in the same week, but are actually better predictors of whether or not we'll see provocations in the following week. And we can change this period of time. The research that I'm referencing as I talk today uses all sorts of variations, everything from trying to predict 1 day out to maybe 10 days out, 14 days out, a month out. And we find the same pattern of behavior. A standard deviation increase in the number of threats increases the probability of a missile or nuclear provocation by somewhere between 11 and 19%, depending on the model that we use. So what I want to reiterate here is that we can view these threats, which come quite frequently and might otherwise look a bit like straw men, maybe that North Korea is crying wolf, or doesn't really have any particular direction. We can actually analyze these threats systematically to try to reveal information about how North Korea perceives and responds to their threat environment. So the content in aggregate of North Korea's threats will point more regularly to key areas that North Korea is thinking about in their strategic analysis, and in particular shows areas of vulnerability for the North Korean regime. They're quite concerned about military exercises, in part because they demonstrate a closeness between South Korea and its allies that would be necessary or at least extremely helpful if South Korea were to end up in a conflict with its northern neighbor. And in addition, we see frequent focus on challenges to North Korea's nuclear program, both related to preemption, but also defensive action like missile defenses that could undercut the effectiveness of North Korea's nuclear capabilities. And it's not just the content of these threats that matter, but patterns over time in when and how many threats North Korea is making. So though threats are frequent, frequency patterns reveal when North Korea has higher levels of resolve and is willing to take more risky actions. That is, North Korea makes threats when they feel vulnerable, and this is also the process that leads them to engage in risky provocative behaviors such as testing missiles or even testing nuclear weapons. And the result of that is that we can use threats to systematically predict North Korea's provocations. And we can see that this rhetoric coming out of North Korea, these threats, although they're quite common, although any individual threat may only tell us so much about North Korea's thinking, this rhetoric that looks really cheap can actually be meaningful if we can analyze it in a systematic and scientific way. So I'll conclude there, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have about North Korean threats or provocations. Thank you.
All right, great. Dr. Sukin, great and a very succinct and scientific research. I like that very much. You've been using machine learning technology, and that actually fits into this the description of scientific research in political science these days. Thank you. And then I have a few questions related to your lecture. And more say policy dimensions. You are emphasizing policy implications for that. So what is policy implications for the South Korea and the United States? The North Korea actually seriously use signaling tactic to aggregate level, not individual probably. So it's a more signaling accumulate about 10 days and 1 month. Then South Korea and the United States and Japan and the People's Republic of China should notice this is going to something happen. So what's the implication for that?
So there are several key implications here. One key takeaway is those who are analyzing North Korean behavior should in fact pay attention to these signals. This isn't new. Lots of military state departments read North Korea's rhetoric. I think it's often difficult to see the forest for the trees, so to speak, and understand what North Korea is actually saying. I offer a methodological approach, I think, to kind of look in aggregate and see what's referenced most frequently. Now, what does that help us understand? It helps us understand what North Korea sees as the key vulnerabilities in its own military strategy. And that gives us different pathways for moving forward. So, for example, if North Korea is very concerned about preemption, about surprise attacks, then that means it's important when actions are taken from the US or South Korea that could have a risk of that sort of surprise attack or preemption activity, that there is some effort made to communicate that these are defensive maneuvers, that these sort of apocalyptic scenarios that North Korea is imagining are not in fact going to happen. So to give a concrete example, one of the things North Korea often talks about when they talk about their concern on military exercises is that military exercises close to the border are actually covers for an incoming invasion. And other elements of my research suggest that when the same exercises are conducted offshore, they're conducted further away from the border, then North Korea's reactions are much quieter to those exact same activities. Right? So if an exercise is being conducted for interoperability purposes and doesn't require, say, detailed knowledge of terrain near the border, moving those exercises physically can help relieve some of that pressure and reduce the likelihood of miscalculation or maybe even accidents, escalation, and that sort of behavior on the North Korea's side.
Do you think in South Korea and then American, Korean and American and probably Japanese, are they aware of this North Korean signaling tactics?
So I think there are mixed views within the sort of scholarly and intelligence communities here. I think there's a tendency to suggest that North Korea is not actually revealing its intentions, even if they are trying to signal that they're unhappy, that it's strategic and that they're trying to manipulate the behavior of their adversaries. And to some degree, this is true, right? You signal in order to try to stop some event from happening. There's a deterrence component to this signaling. What I'm arguing is that this isn't some random program of manipulation. If it were, what we would expect is the same degree of vitriol for every exercise. North Korea would always sort of escalate to its maximum possible rhetoric. And that's not really the case. North Korea is making these very extreme threats, but how many they make, how extreme they are, how condensed they are, that's varying. And that sort of variation doesn't really have any purpose other than signaling real intentions. So I think we have to maybe go a little bit further than some previous analysis has said in suggesting that the signaling is not just a manipulation tactic, but that there are also real security concerns. Right? And we might think of North Korea as facing this particularly intense security dilemma. They have, from their perspective, threats on all sides, which they constantly have to be vigilant about. And so they have this very tight incentive to try to make sure that they are monitoring and communicating about those threats at all times. But because of the intensity of that threat, the intensity of the rhetoric, it's easy to kind of dismiss this behavior as maybe just an unusual quirk of a particularly aggressive regime.
From comparative, political, methodology point of view, and do you see any other comparable cases in other part of the world? North Korea actually doing, I mean,
Yeah.
is a very, very big, field, in political science, international security, but I'm just curious.
So I've done some work recently working with NATO on understanding Russia's nuclear threats and have a similar argument I think we can make there. Russia, of course, now makes semi-frequent nuclear threats, not nearly approaching the frequency of North Korea, but we can still see variations in Russian rhetoric between threats that are kind of made once and then never really repeated versus threats that come up really frequently and actually do seem to capture some real issues, some kind of critical attention that Russia has. I think one of the key differences that we see there between those sort of low-level threats and high-level threats are the deterrent threats, saying, for example, NATO should not send forces into Ukraine. Those are much more powerful than compellant threats saying, maybe NATO should take some action. And we see the same thing in North Korea's behavior too. The deterrent threats, don't escalate from a military exercise, don't initiate a preemptive activity. Those threats are relatively compelling and they're repeated very often. North Korea also makes lots of compellant threats. South Korea and the United States should no longer cooperate with each other. Japan should apologize for past behavior. Not only do those things not happen, of course, but they're much less frequent. And so I think we see North Korea understands their limitations to what its nuclear arsenal can do. It can deter, but it can't compel. It can't change the shape of geopolitics in the way that maybe North Korea might want it to.
All right. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. Today, we invited Ankit Pandanen, the Stanton, Senior Fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His research interest includes a nuclear strategy, escalation, missiles, and then missile defense system. And he also, wrote a book, published a book Kim Jong-un and bomb, and then survival and deterrence in North Korea from the Oxford. And it's a great pleasure, to have you, Mr. Panda, and then hope, we listen to your interesting and a very intriguing, lecture, and then we will have a probably 15 to 20 minute, Q&A session. Floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peck. I appreciate this opportunity to speak to you today about some of my research and observations. The theme of my talk today is North Korea's missile strategy. So I'll speak a bit about the specific role of missiles in North Korea's national defense strategy, the kinds of capabilities that North Korea possesses, and a few other issues relating to the country's missile programs. So the place to start, I think, before we talk about missiles in North Korea, is to first talk about nuclear deterrence. This is now a priority for North Korea's national defense strategy. I think it's fair to say it's the centerpiece of the country's national defense approach. It is the cornerstone of the way in which North Korean leader Kim Jong-un thinks about his country's defense. North Korea, of course, over the last 3 decades, has been on a quest to seek credible deterrence vis-a-vis the United States in particular. And over the last several years, Kim Jong-un has largely accomplished that objective, accomplished it in a fairly viable way. He's gone about demonstrating to the United States that North Korea possesses intercontinental delivery systems. These are long-range missiles that are designed to travel across the globe to potentially hold at risk targets in the continental United States. But at the same time, Kim Jong-un has also built a diverse nuclear arsenal, which also comprises nuclear-capable missiles that can be launched from submarines, nuclear-capable missiles that are shorter range, that are designed to hold targets on the Korean Peninsula, in South Korea, and in Japan, and other parts of the Indo-Pacific region, to include Okinawa, Guam, Hawaii, also at risk with nuclear weapons. The basic purpose of nuclear deterrence is to, of course, guarantee the survival of the Kim regime, but at the same time, nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence confer on the states that possess them a certain room for maneuver in international politics. And I think this is also true of North Korea. I think this is part of the reason why I think we're seeing Kim Jong-un behave with perhaps more confidence than we've ever seen him project in his now 12 years in power at the helm of North Korea. So making nuclear deterrence work, of course, requires credible capabilities, credible military capabilities. And this has really been central to the way in which North Korea has thought about its missile forces over time. Today, in 2024, heading into 2025, North Korea remains in the process of a missile modernization process. This is broadly part of its nuclear and military modernization. The modernization agenda was broadly laid out by leader Kim Jong-un in January 2021 at the 8th Party Congress of the Workers' Party of Korea, when Kim Jong-un outlined many objectives for his missile forces. He talked about qualitative improvements, improving his missiles, making them better, making them more precise, more lethal, more responsive, and at the same time also pursuing a quantitative modernization, which includes, of course, the expansion of the country's missile force, and most importantly, perhaps, the pursuit of nuclear fissile materials to build new warheads to go on those missiles. But for the rest of my talk, I'll mostly focus on the missile systems. I should also note here, of course, that we are in a new strategic environment in Northeast Asia today, where North Korea is rapidly deepening its partnerships with new countries, most prominent of these being the Russian Federation. Russia's longstanding policy in the aftermath of the Cold War, after the Soviet Union collapsed, was a policy of equidistance towards Seoul and Pyongyang. Today, Russia makes no pretense of equidistance. It is unequivocally far closer to North Korea and has essentially pulled North Korea into its broader orbit, seeking to take advantage of Kim Jong-un's willingness to run risks by sending missiles, munitions of all kinds, including artillery and mortars, and now personnel, Korean People's Army troops, to fight on the battlefields of Eastern Europe. Specifically, North Korean troops appear to be now present in Russia, fighting alongside Russian soldiers in Kursk. But this, of course, raises the obvious question about what exactly are the North Koreans getting in return. And I'll get to this in a moment as well. So let's zoom out for a minute. Missiles are not uniquely a North Korean predilection. Every nuclear-armed state today around the world favors missiles as their primary delivery system for choice. What is a missile? A missile is simply a means of delivery for a given payload that makes use of a rocket booster system. You have ballistic missiles and cruise missiles to simplify things a little bit. Cruise missiles are best thought of as essentially uncrewed aircraft without landing gears. They often use very much the same propulsion principles, at least. They fly within the Earth's atmosphere, but North Korea primarily relies on ballistic missiles for nuclear delivery. These are designed to elevate payloads, in many cases, to outside of the Earth's atmosphere, then allowing them to head towards their target, relying on nothing more, in many cases, than atmospheric drag and gravity. The North Koreans have also, of course, made substantial improvements to the precision of their missiles over time, including by adding, in many cases, inertial guidance, GPS guidance, and other forms of improvements to their precision capabilities. Now, this has, of course, made North Korea's nuclear capabilities more threatening and more lethal, but at the same time, it does contribute to the country's broader conventional modernization as well. And I think this should not be forgotten when we talk about North Korea's missile capabilities. Another important trend that we see in North Korea, particularly since 2017, which was the year that North Korea really crossed many of the key qualitative thresholds, is just a remarkable focus in North Korea on basing its missiles in new and different modes. And so what basing essentially means is the format in which the missile is physically kept in either a state of readiness or in a state of preparation to be deployed in a time of conflict. And so North Korea releases its missiles from road mobile systems. These are essentially large trucks that can carry missiles around the country. The North Koreans have shown that they can launch missiles from submarines. They have even put missiles on rail cars. At one point, they even launched missiles from an underwater submerged pontoon in an inland lake, demonstrating, I think, to the United States and South Korea just how challenging the problem of targeting these missiles might become in a time of war. All of this in cumulative is designed to make North Korea's nuclear forces and missile forces more broadly a lot more survivable, essentially making them impervious, or at least more impervious to a disarming strike attempt by South Korea and the United States. I think the North Koreans understand that in a time of war, it would be important for South Korea and the United States to combine their resources and efforts to try and locate every North Korean missile, every North Korean nuclear warhead, and attempt to destroy them so as to limit damage against their own societies. The North Koreans are making this task more difficult day by day. On that particular note, my opinion is that this task that the U.S. and South Korea have set out to accomplish is essentially going to be out of reach, I think, for the near future. Let's move on a little bit to missile testing and missile launches from North Korea. This, of course, is a vexing issue for many of our friends in South Korea in particular who describe these launches as provocations. And certainly they are illegal. They are prescribed by UN Security Council resolutions. That is undeniable. But the North Koreans push ahead anyways. They are undeterred by international law and the requirements of UN Security Council resolutions, and because nuclear deterrence is central to their national defense, they feel a compulsive need to continue launching these missiles. But the point I want to make on missile launching in North Korea today in 2024 is that we need to change our vocabulary when we talk about these events. In the past, we used to fairly accurately describe most missile launches in North Korea as tests. This was the idea that the North Koreans were building capability, they were experimenting, they were developing capabilities, they were seeing if their missile technologies would actually work as designed. Today, that does not really appear to be the case. The majority of North Korean missile launches since 2022 onwards have actually not been tests, they have been exercises. And I think this really underscores the degree to which North Korea has become a very capable possessor of missile technologies in general, and is now operationalizing its missile capabilities to contribute to both conventional and nuclear deterrence through operational exercises. From a policy perspective, the missile launching problem in peacetime is a difficult one for the US and South Korea, because I would actually make the argument that we as an alliance don't have a very useful deterrence toolkit for dealing specifically with the problem of peacetime missile launches. Why do I say this? Well, I've made the point already that international legal obligations don't do much to deter the North Koreans. Neither do sanctions, nor are the threats of force against North Korea likely to be credible or effective. And so we have basically two toolkits when it comes to deterrence. We can either threaten punishment or we can deny benefits. Neither is convincing when we talk about peacetime missile launches by North Korea. We cannot, of course, threaten punishment militarily against North Korea. It's not credible. The US and South Korea would have to be incredibly risk acceptant. I think the North Koreans understand that that is not the kind of cost that they would suffer for testing missiles in peacetime. And by the same token, denial, which has an application in thinking about deterrence of North Korean armed attacks on South Korea, denial doesn't really give us a good toolkit for dealing with the missile launch problem either, because when the North Koreans launch missiles, even if those missile launches fail, they will benefit. They acquire data, they acquire diagnostics, they acquire very useful information to continue refining their missile capabilities over time. And so the way in which this problem must be dealt with ultimately is one of, first of all, compartmentalizing missile launches in peacetime from the broader challenges that we face with North Korea as a US-ROK alliance, which is, of course, the prospect of North Korea initiating a deliberate conflict on the Korean Peninsula, which is the primary concern, I think, for the United States. The US and South Korea, I think, ultimately must be vigilant to changes in North Korea's approach to nuclear deterrence and missile capabilities in general. Now, I've been watching North Korea for a long time, and the good news is I do see more continuity than change in North Korea's strategic direction when it comes to nuclear weapons capabilities. What is, of course, concerning is Kim Jong-un's apparent growing confidence, which I think is in part a function of the greater confidence that Kim has in his own nuclear and missile capabilities. I think this is giving North Korea the room for maneuver in international politics that I think Kim Jong-un has potentially long sought. Kim is, of course, responding to geopolitical changes in Northeast Asia, and in the world more broadly, adapting to a period of great power competition between the US, Russia, and China. Before I conclude my remarks, though, I want to just underscore a few other points that I think speak to North Korea's adapting or the ways in which North Korea is adapting to this new environment. North Korea continues to have serious security concerns that I think do influence the ways in which it is operationalizing its missile strategy. I've referred to this before in this talk, but I do want to emphasize that the primary concern that North Korea has when it comes to deterrence and dissuasion more broadly is the scenario of a conventional attack against the country that results in the end of the regime. This is something that the US and South Korea explicitly promised North Korea if it ever uses nuclear weapons. And so Kim Jong-un has addressed this in a number of ways. In September 2022, North Korea revised its nuclear doctrine, for instance, to threaten the automatic and immediate retaliation against South Korea and the United States with nuclear weapons, even in a scenario where Kim Jong-un was killed or removed from power or North Korea's nuclear command and control systems were otherwise interrupted. At the same time, I think we see evidence that North Korea is adapting its command and control practices to ensure that Kim Jong-un can exercise control over his missile forces and his nuclear forces. The best way to think about command and control for non-experts, at least non-experts in nuclear weapons, is that they are the central nervous system of any nuclear force. It doesn't matter how good your missiles are, how reliable your nuclear warheads are, if you don't have the command and control systems to ensure that you can maintain control of those weapons, to have access to resort to their use when needed, and to also at the same time ensure that those weapons are never used accidentally or without authorization. I think both of these are important priorities for Kim Jong-un. Finally, let me close by just talking a little bit about the complementarity that I see between North Korea's intercontinental forces and its shorter range theater forces. There was a reason that Kim Jong-un did not declare his nuclear deterrent complete before 2017. 2017 was the year when North Korea demonstrated ICBMs. The fundamental challenge for the North Koreans was, how do you resolve and project deterrence messages to South Korea and the US forces on the Korean Peninsula, while at the same time deterring the United States, which is a global superpower with nuclear capabilities, half a globe away? And the answer to that problem for the North Koreans was intercontinental weapons. But at the same time, intercontinental weapons aren't going to be the ones that the North Koreans choose to employ at the start of a nuclear conflict. Those will be the shorter range systems. And so for the North Koreans, both components of their broader strategic deterrence approach remain central. And so we can't really disentangle the ICBMs and the short range capabilities. They are part and parcel of the ways in which the North Koreans conceive of their missile strategy and their nuclear deterrence strategy more broadly. So, Dr. Peck, I think I will stop there, and I look forward to engaging with you in a discussion. Thank you.
All All right. Thank you for your concrete and detailed, lecture on this, North Korea's missile, technology and the missile, capacity. Then, my first question might be, how do you, for our, the audience is informed public. So your technical prowess is pretty impressive, and that actually informed me very well. I learned a lot. But how do you evaluate the North Korea's missile capacity level in terms of the other countries? I mean, level of probably it's not probably the United States or Russia, probably not China. But which country can you compare with North Korea?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, I would say that we underrate and underestimate the North Koreans at our own peril. I think it's difficult to draw direct comparisons between the North Korean program and other countries. There's a lot of peculiarities in North Korea. The North Koreans have, by some counts, I think, more active missile development programs, or at least prototypes, than most other countries. I mean, they simply develop a variety of missiles in ways that really don't appear to be economical. But I think in many ways, the North Koreans exhibit sophistication in some regards that might be on par with countries like Iran, like Pakistan, India, and other countries that have possessed missiles and nuclear capabilities for quite a bit of time. Of course, the evidence we have does still have limits, although I have to say the debris that's been recovered from Ukraine, where North Korean ballistic missiles have been used, including newer North Korean ballistic missiles, does, of course, allow us to get some interesting insights about how these missiles have performed and how the North Koreans have gone about procuring components, including from overseas, to build these missiles. But overall, I will say, for the purposes of deterrence, missiles don't have to be perfect, right? This is a centerpiece of the debate, particularly in South Korea, about whether the North Koreans, for instance, have a re-entry vehicle for their ICBMs, or whether their missiles are reliable enough to achieve their deterrence objectives. Deterrence is fundamentally not about the nuts and bolts of capabilities, although credibility does matter in that regard, but it's fundamentally the act of manifesting in the mind of your adversary the threat of essentially things going wrong in a time of war and in a time of conflict. And I think the North Korean missile force in aggregate is sufficient in its sophistication to accomplish that objective vis-a-vis both the US and South Korea, I would argue.
Yeah, at the same time, it's missiles, ICBM and short and middle range missiles are meaningful for the deterrence because it has nuclear weapons. Nuclear warhead put on the missiles, and that makes the difference of North Korea's missile capacity and then deterrence capacity. But then my next question is going to be, how about South Korea? How do you evaluate missile capacity of South Korea so far in comparison with the North Korea and probably France or UK?
So South Korea is incredibly impressive in its missile prowess. It is one of the most sophisticated non-nuclear countries with ballistic missile capabilities. South Korea has an array of short-range ballistic and cruise missiles with really impressive degrees of precision, which South Korea repeatedly publicly demonstrates to, I think, accomplish the credibility of its own deterrence vis-a-vis North Korea, communicating to Kim Jong-un that in a time of conflict, that South Korea will be able to find Kim personally, that South Korea will be able to destroy North Korean missiles. The problem still, I think, for South Korea is not the actual missile itself, right? I think we know that South Korean missiles are very impressive in what they can accomplish. It's all of the enabling technologies and associated military tasks that factor into what experts call the kill chain. The kill chain is this. I should be careful with my terminology because South Korea has a strategy called the kill chain, which is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the kill chain in the generalized sense that term is used in the field of strategic studies, where it refers to essentially the ability to find, fix, and finish a target, where the finding part is actually quite difficult in North Korea, right? So in a time of conflict, the North Koreans will be hiding their capabilities, they'll be moving them around, they'll be driving their missile systems around their country where they have mountains, forests, tunnels, and other kinds of areas where they can shelter and hide from South Korea's intelligence capabilities. But the problem for South Korea will fundamentally be finding the targets. And once the targets are found, the South Koreans can strike them with a fair degree of reliability. But that task is quite difficult. And this isn't just a problem for South Korea. I would argue that this problem of finding North Korean missiles, mobile missiles, in a time of conflict is going to be very difficult for the United States as well, and likely will remain intractable. And I actually don't expect that even artificial intelligence capabilities, which are starting to get quite a bit of interest, including in South Korea, will be able to rectify this in a time of war, at least not at a high enough level of probability.
Yeah.
South Korea's missile ambitions, though, I think have taken on an interesting character in recent years. South Korea is now building extremely large payload conventional missiles. The largest conventional payload missiles in the world today are fielded by South Korea, such as the Hyunwoo 5 and these other sort of accompanying missile systems, which are designed to penetrate deeply buried targets in North Korea as well. So we see on the Korean Peninsula, I think, two very different approaches to missile technologies and capabilities. But for both South Korea and North Korea, missiles are central to their national deterrence strategies and defense strategies. The problem that I would highlight, though, on the Korean Peninsula that does give me concern as an analyst who thinks about escalation in particular is, of course, the preemptive preference that exists in both North and South Korea, where in both countries' missile strategies, there is a premium placed on striking first. And that is a recipe for instability because it creates what the American nuclear strategist Thomas Schelling, for instance, once described as the reciprocal fear of surprise attack, where in a time of crisis, when A and B, we don't have to call them North and South Korea, but A and B, if A wants to shoot first and B wants to shoot first, both will be worried that the other will go first, which creates pressures to go first to avoid having the other go first. And so you can see how that can get quite dangerous. And so this is a problem that I think requires addressing. It is difficult, of course, to address this cooperatively with the North Koreans, given that the North Koreans have no interest in speaking with South Korea or the United States today. But the argument that I make is that essentially there are ways in which South Korea and the United States can adapt our approach to deterrence vis-a-vis North Korea without placing a premium on going first, essentially, in the way that we currently do.
And then it just you just read me to the next question again and again, and then but basically what you are saying, or the other experts on the missile systems and the missile weapon system and nuclear weapon system, basically the United States cannot do anything about North Korean nuclear and the missile technology development. Is it right?
Technology development is very difficult at this point to roll back or limit. I think we can do something very important still, which is create friction for the North Koreans. And so I think that is essentially the purpose of our sanctions and counterproliferation efforts and export controls. I referenced the debris that we've recovered from Ukraine, where we've been able to look into North Korea's new missiles. We understand from that debris that the North Koreans are still very good at illicit procurement. They are procuring various components from the United States and other Western countries. And so the purpose of our broader counterproliferation approach to North Korea must be to make life difficult for Kim Jong-un.
Sure.
We're not going to deprive North Korea of the knowledge they've already acquired. And unfortunately, the knowledge they have already acquired is so sufficient, is sufficient to the point where they've even indigenized large parts of the missile supply chain. They are able to construct even large, fairly complex liquid propellant engines and solid propellant engines domestically with some inputs from overseas. But
you mean Russia?
From Russia, yes, but also from other countries. This is essentially technological prowess that predates the ongoing cooperation between Russia and North Korea, which I think we'll get to in a minute, but I think can lead us to dangerous territory if the Russians do decide to fully cooperate with the North Koreans in developing these capabilities. But so I don't mean to say that we don't have any ability to affect North Korea's choices or the way in which it approaches its capabilities, but I genuinely think that rolling back North Korea's capabilities or limiting North Korea's ambitions or pursuit of certain capabilities that it deems to be strategically significant for its deterrence needs is unlikely to be successful. And so I think the most practical approach is to focus on the friction that our efforts can introduce into Kim Jong-un's efforts to buttress his nuclear forces.
My last question is going to be on Russia. What would be the role of Russia in this advancing even more? North Korean, missile and nuclear technology.
It's unclear at this point the degree to which Russia and North Korea are meaningfully cooperating in the area of nuclear and missile technology specifically. And I just say that to point out that the evidence is still indeterminate. We don't have any smoking guns, but of course this is an area where the United States and South Korea must be vigilant, given the extremely serious consequences for U.S. and South Korean security if North Korea does receive assistance from the Russian Federation. There are reasons to be skeptical that this is the area where cooperation is most likely to manifest. In the Russia-North Korea relationship, we do have an asymmetry, we have an imbalance, we have something of a transactional logic, even if the relationship isn't purely transactional. There is a genuine strategic logic pulling Russia and North Korea together. But the reason I highlight that is that even if Kim Jong-un asks Vladimir Putin for the world, he asks for access to Russian nuclear weapons designs, for advanced Russian ICBM technologies, the Russians don't have to begin cooperation in that area. They can assist the North Koreans with they can offer other things. They can improve Kim Jong-un's air defense capabilities. So they can improve North Korea's command and control capabilities. Military satellites are even an area where the Russians might be able to assist the North Koreans. And the Russians do still have an interest. It's not the same interest that they had perhaps 5 or 10 years ago on non-proliferation, but they do still have an interest in non-proliferation from the perspective of at least diluting their own status in the international system as a global superpower with nuclear weapons by deliberately spreading nuclear technology. I think this is part of the reason why even during the Cold War, the Soviet Union began to favor non-proliferation, apart from, of course, the implications for its own security interests if nuclear weapons were to spread. Now, the North Koreans, of course, have their own nuclear weapons as well already. So I suspect you're going to see a push and pull here where the North Koreans are likely behind the scenes asking the Russians for quite a bit. The Russians, I do think, will cooperate in some areas, but in the most sensitive areas, strategic missile technologies, nuclear weapons, I think the pace of cooperation will still likely be fairly modest. Now, I do want to note here, though, that the treaty that Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un concluded earlier this year, a treaty that's now been ratified by both countries through their respective legal processes, Article 10 of that treaty includes language on peaceful nuclear energy cooperation, which is interesting because it can offer a justification or a fig leaf for technology transfer from Russia on nuclear fuel cycle technologies in particular, where the Russians have tremendous expertise. This could include, of course, helping the North Koreans with their gas centrifuge capabilities, which are essential for producing highly enriched uranium, which can be used in nuclear weapons. The Russians could even assist the North Koreans with experimentation, with new, more efficient reprocessing techniques for plutonium. The North Koreans are, of course, building what we think is still an experimental light water reactor at Yongbyon. Russian technical assistance could also accelerate the entry into operation of that particular facility. So there are many ways in which this cooperation could substantially change the contours of how we've traditionally thought about North Korea's capabilities. But I still think the most likely area where we are going to see evidence of concrete Russian assistance is going to be in the area of conventional arms and potentially space.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peck.
All right. Today, we invited, very renowned, world-renowned, scholar and then policy analyst, Orysia Lutsevychga, and who is a deputy director at Russia and the Eurasian program, and then head of the Ukraine Forum and a Chatham House. We are going to listen to, Orysia Lutsevychga, the great expert, on the Ukraine's position, toward or perception toward, North Korea's dispatch of, troops to, Russia. Okay, the floor is all yours, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pike. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for this invitation to contribute the insights as we see them from one of the largest land wars in Europe since the Second World War. As you've introduced me, I am heading Ukraine program in Chatham House that we have launched after the annexation of Crimea, soon 10 years ago. This actually marks the beginning of the Russian war against Ukraine in 2014, when part of Ukrainian sovereign territory was annexed. And then on the eastern part of Ukraine, the hybrid war using all kinds of proxy groups and special forces in the Donbass region was started. Yesterday, we have marked 1,000 days of a full-scale invasion of Russia against Ukraine. And as I would like to recall our listeners, this war has been declared by the majority of the countries in the world on the 2nd of March at the UN General Assembly as an unprovoked act of aggression. And the General Assembly of UN has called on Russia to withdraw all its troops. But unfortunately, this is not where we are. As I am talking to you, we are actually seeing a new spike of escalation with Russia involving North Korea into this war, and we'll discuss what it actually means. But first, I think with anything in life or in politics, it is about the story that we are telling ourselves about what is actually going on. And to be honest, if you look at the West, Russia, Ukraine, and the rest of the world, including Northeast Asia, we are telling a bit different stories. So for the West is saying that it is helping Ukraine resist Russian invasion, and it at all costs is trying to avoid a direct escalation or direct war with Russia. It is also presenting this war as the war of autocracies versus democracies. Ukraine is not fully consolidated, but democracy according to all surveys. And Russia is an autocratic regime that has Putin in power now for more than 25 years, since 2000, really. And it looks like for the West as if they are doing a beneficial action to somebody in Europe. Russia, in the way, is declaring that it wants to destroy Western-based order and wants to free itself, as the way it portrays, from the US imposed straitjacket. For some reason, Putin's regime has built itself on this confrontation against the West, and it declares that it must liberate itself from all the constraints as they see by US presence in Europe. And it wants to get Russia off the knees. This is the sentiment. It's a revanchist sentiment. But now they even reached further. They say we want to put the West on its knees. And this is the ideological war for Putin against Western principles, Western values, anti-freedom, imperial aggression, and it's legitimized by for the Russian publics as something that Russia is reclaiming what it belongs to Russia, like a correcting historical injustice, as if these lands in Ukraine are not Ukrainian, but they belong to Russia in the legitimate historical right. So you already see different stories between the West and the Russia. And now Ukraine, that is a victim of invasion, says that it is fighting the war of independence. It's an existential fight for Ukraine for the right to choose the future. And Ukraine is trying to convince that the outcome of this war matters for the whole of the world, that it is not just Ukraine, that if it loses on the battlefield, will be denied its sovereignty and it will be annihilated as a political nation. But if Russia prevails, we will have the emboldenment of the axis of revanchist autocracies from China to Iran to Russia to even Venezuela recently, as we have seen some statements, to some of the revisionist powers in Africa, to use force in order to change borders and in order to achieve their national interest and their objectives. So Ukraine is trying to say, this is not just about Ukraine, it's about the world order. And if we want to have any chances to coexist as free independent nations and prosper, we must restore basic rules of the UN Charter. Now, in the Northeast Asia, I think what you see, and you correct me if I am wrong, is that Russia is acting very recklessly to upset the balance that is already, quite fragile. That Russia, on one hand, is trying to meddle in the Chinese, as China sees it, sphere of influence, and tries to lure countries like Vietnam, North Korea into support for its aggression and into support for its confrontation with the United States. Because, of course, when Russia presents the offer to countries in the global south, in Latin America, in Africa, it says it's about squeezing America out. Again, it's about injustice, that this global international order that emerged after the Cold War, where we, countries like Russia and maybe others, do not have the right to basically cast the dice and behave the way we want. So Putin's trip, especially in the summer of this year in the region, demonstrated that he is prepared to play this global game, and his aim is to sit at the table together with China, with the United States, and to divide the world into the spheres of influence. Putin's mindset is very 19th century. When somebody asked who are Putin's advisors, the answer was Peter I and Catherine the Great. He envisages himself as this ruler over the world where the sun never sets, in a way. So these are the stories in terms of geopolitics, and why we have this clash and confrontation, that different sides of this struggle tell themselves. Now, I think we are missing quite a lot, at least in the public discourse, when we hear these narratives. And what we are missing is that the Russia's aim is actually to undermine the cohesion of alliances from Northeast Asia to the Atlantic. Russia's approach to power is to divide and rule. They do not like collective security alliances, either, US alliance in Asia or NATO alliance in Europe. In fact, we are already in the new arms race for technologies that will define the future winners. What we see right now in Ukraine on the battlefield is a revolution in warfare. We can talk a little bit more about it, but that basically means that Ukraine becomes like a battlefield for testing of how American and Western technology and weapons can perform against the Russian weapons and technology. And we do know that Russia supplies widely weapons to other countries, from India to Africa to Brazil, the air fighter jets. And all these countries are watching which technology in a way will prevail and which technology is more effective. And we actually also have a fight for critical minerals and semiconductors that are so much needed for rearming. Ukraine itself is quite resource-rich country. It has the 11th in the world and second in Europe resource of ilmenite that is needed for semiconductors. So having occupied Ukrainian land, it also means that Russia occupies some of its critical minerals and in a way prevents from those resources being both used for Ukraine and for wider European rearmament. It is also about the control of trade routes. We have seen from day one of this war how Russia in the Black Sea basically prevented Ukraine to ship its grain, to ship its metallurgic products, where 80% of Ukrainian commodity trade was going through the Black Sea. Because it's cheaper, you can ship bigger volumes. Of course, Ukraine had to adapt since then, but most importantly, Ukraine engaged in the battle over the Black Sea. And I think this is very interesting for Northeast Asia how Ukraine managed to destroy 30% of Russian fleet, and how Russian fleet had to leave the base of Crimea further into the Sea of Azov, and Ukraine has reopened the trade route. This is what it is about. It's also about the control of the trade and seas in order to exert violent pressure on the economies of those countries. And I imagine you can hear the similarities of what may happen in case there is a Chinese violent action against the Taiwan. Ukraine succeeded actually in repelling some of these blockade by using the sea drones. That is, again, the new technology that enabled Ukraine not having basically a big fleet or dominance, aviation dominance, to achieve its objectives and unblock trade routes. That is a lifeline not only for Ukraine, but also for global food security. And last and not least, the big story is that if Russia really subjugates Ukraine, it does become a European superpower. Right now, to be honest, the leverage of Russia, it's mainly in raw materials, in resources that are based in Siberia. And without having this European anchor in Ukraine, Russia is really more of an Asian power. If it controls Ukraine, it becomes more of a Eurasian, pan-European power that is able to exert pressure on Eastern Europe and on Europe more broadly. So you see, the outcome of Ukraine matters. And the battle that evolves right now is for much bigger stake than just some villages in eastern Ukraine where the news dominates that Russia took this village or that village, or Ukraine has retreated from that position. We are missing a big story if we are just focusing on the land war. So, of course, now I understand the interest about this bilateral security cooperation between Russia and North Korea. And I think here in Europe, this is viewed as a big escalation. Of course, right now, we see the deployment of those troops in Kursk region, where Ukraine has occupied quite a large part of Russian territory, actually larger part than Russia has occupied throughout the whole of 2024 inside Ukraine. And these troops are being deployed now to build the fighting force, around 50,000, together with the Russians, in order to squeeze Ukrainians out of Kursk, in order to decrease the leverage that Ukraine may have at the eventual negotiations, so that it cannot use Kursk as a bargaining chip versus against Putin at the table. So, of course, you understand how this impacts Ukraine, and a lot of anxiety in Europe as well, how this changes the involvement of the third parties. I've seen some reporting in public sources that this North Korean contingent may increase even up to 100,000. That is a very significant number, because if this first deployment goes unpunished and there's no retribution that neither North Korea nor Russia pays, then there will be emboldenment to use more and more. So what it actually means, this fact on the ground, is that there is indeed a risk of a wider war, because of the scale of North Korean involvement, and because also of this new security agreement that North Korea has signed with Russia, that was ratified by Russian Duma in June of 2024, that actually makes Russia now a security guarantor of North Korea. But as we know, that this bloc is very aggressive, unlike NATO, that indeed, after 3 years of one of the largest wars in Europe, is holding the line, defensive lines. I would suspect that this agreement between North Korea and Russia could be used for a harassment of South Korea, and could embolden Kim Jong-un to actually make more aggressive moves beyond some of the aggressive statements and actions that he already taken. And you know them better than me, the destruction of bridges, the monuments, and defining South Korea as an enemy, not as a part of the same family and nation that could reunite at some point of time. So that also means that these North Korean troops are getting combat experience against the American weapons and training the special forces and infantry in new warfare. As I have said, the warfare is changing. So that actually means that they may learn the drones, they may learn the electronic warfare. They have not been in combat since the 50s. Right? So this is a new age of war. This is what they're getting from this. And of course, they are getting dangerous new technologies that I think we all should be aware that it could include satellite launch system. It could include nuclear submarine technology, ballistic missile technology. Putin and Kim are not doing it out of charity. There is a very transactional relationship between the two. And in addition to access of some of this technology, the regime in North Korea is getting quite significant financial payments to sustain its system. And it could amount to more than 300 million in US dollars for all these payments to the troops being deployed on the ground. And in a more cynical way, they also will be fed, by the Russians, and it will also relax some pressure on the humanitarian situation inside the North Korea. So, of course, China is also uneased. I think there's unease in Beijing about this move. We can speculate because China is keeping very quiet, I guess, weighing its position. But I think they are dissatisfied that Putin is meddling in his region, and that is upsetting a special relationship between North Korea and China, where that basically allows Kim to build really not bilateral, but multivectoral policy. Previously, he was solely dependent on Beijing. Now, Putin is rolling the red carpet in front of him, and he is receiving him in Pyongyang. So this actually, I am sure, meddles and confuses Chinese cards. And also because of more reckless behavior of the two dictators, one in Russia and one in North Korea, Beijing is not able to go at its own speed. Because I think the pressure on reunification or military action against Taiwan in China is different than the pressure Putin faces in its battle against the West. So this actually complicates a lot of things, and also could escalate events in the region in case of a direct war over there. And last but not least, I think we should understand that the outcome of this war, if Putin's troops are defeated on sovereign territory of Ukraine, which right now Putin controls 20% of sovereign territory of Ukraine, that would have actually detrimental effects to his regime stability inside Russia, and by proxy, because now North Korea is also involved in this, into North Korean stability. That actually could open a new channels of policies for reunification, because if this axis of evil, so to say, is defeated in Ukraine jointly by the coalition of the willing, who sees the national security really threatened by this alliance, then we could, in a way, bring back time in joint, so to speak, and we could set more opportunities in motion for finally ending the war between North and South Korea. I am, as a Ukrainian, often given an example of a settlement between North and South Korea as an example for Ukraine. And my answer to that, it's not an ideal solution First, because it only freezes the war and postpone it for the future, as I have said, is an opportunity and dangerous trajectory right now. But two, it also requires the stationment of American troops on Ukrainian soil, like they are in South Korea. And with Trump in the White House and with American isolationism, this is an unlikely scenario. So we shouldn't be proposing remedies that are actually a poison. So I will stop here and say that I'd love to hear your questions about it. And it's a very dynamic situation that will be evolving by day, and we all need to watch it very carefully. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your very extensive and comprehensive analysis on this North Korean troops and dispatch to Russia, and then confronting Ukraine soldiers in the front line. Yeah, I mean there are a lot of things that come to my mind, and let's just start with some small question, and we will getting bigger. And do you think you are saying that this defeating North Korean and Russian troops together, about 50,000 soldiers who already deployed together? We do not know how many North Korean soldiers in the real front line and the entrenchment, but there. And then do you think the Ukraine government prioritize attack on North Korean soldiers rather than no Russian soldiers? You mentioned that if North Korean soldiers are largely safe or insulated from the damage, and then that actually propel North Korea to circulate their 10,000, then 20,000 and 30,000 coming back and forth, and that's going to be a long time battle resources for the Russian Federation. So what's your take? You seems to me you are very good at the military strategy and the weapon systems and all those things too.
Well, that is not my main specialization, just for the listeners. But of course, we all now have to learn the art of war and unfortunately become security experts, because the life around us becomes, unfortunately less and less secure. I think from the open sources that we see is that Russians are really, integrating North Korean troops into their force formations. They're even putting them with the Russian uniforms. They're giving them Russian identification documents so that they look like they are Russian soldiers from the Far East. So, they blend in with the Buryat or other minority from Russia. Yes, so that is well known. So for Ukraine, Ukrainian intelligence, of course, knows where the locations of the formations are. And so far they have been deployed to a small degree in Donbass, but mainly they have been used in Kursk. I think what is significant after this deployment, that yesterday we have seen the first long-range strike by Ukraine using ATACMS, American long-range weapons, 300 kilometers, against the warehouses where reportedly there's materiel that North Koreans brought with them to fight against Ukrainian army. These warehouses were destroyed. And I think the list of high-value targets that Ukraine is providing to United States, because let's remember, this is a very, Ukrainians are trying to be very cooperative with the United States because they understand the responsibility of a nuclear power like United States assisting non-nuclear state to defeat a nuclear state. So we are in this, we've never been in such a situation. This is, again, the new type of war we are talking about to a degree. So I think the coalition supporting Ukraine will prioritize, of course, the military storages and deployments of North Korean to send a very clear message to North Korean leadership, that they will take very, very heavy casualties, like Russians are already taking. If you think about the daily loss of Russian soldiers right now in Ukraine, it's 1,500 on average. For a month, they are losing about 35,000 soldiers. And they are right now avoiding, again, a total mobilization of their own people because they have North Koreans. And this is, believe me, this close combat with drones, with mines, with anti-tank missiles, with everything that Ukraine has is very, very bloody, you know. And another thing is that the evacuation of soldiers who are wounded, who are dead, is actually not taking place. We have many reportings that Russians are just abandoning all those bodies and taking no care. And when Ukrainians are trying to evacuate wounded soldiers, they are hitting them from the drones, the medical equipment. So it's the war that has no rules. And there will be heavy casualties that North Korean troops will have when they will cross the line.
Okay. So, I mean, you just mentioned about this, volatility of this North Korea-Russia rapprochement and military cooperation. And then that's directly related to, North Korean nuclear capacity enhancement. You mentioned that Russia can provide, nuclear technologies and then ICBM missile, technologies, for the North Korea. That actually make, Northeast Asian in the security structure is very unstable. But we understand that. But what about the other side of a world, and then Ukraine and Russia? You mentioned that just nuclear states actually helping non-nuclear state to defeat nuclear state. That actually lead us into the question of the Ukraine's potential nuclearization in the future. And then Volodymyr Zelensky, president actually hinted the possibility of Ukraine's nuclearization. I think in my view is pretty long shot, but I think Ukraine is very capable of the arming with the nuclear weapons, unless the Ukraine is not allowed to join or protected by the NATO and especially in the American troops. What do you think?
You are right in connecting the statements about the nuclear status to Ukraine's security dilemma. Because why Russia has invaded Ukraine? Because it was defenseless. Because at the moment of full-scale invasion, Ukraine actually, according to its constitution in 2014, was a neutral state. Not only was it neutral, but it had very, very small army. I mean, it was the post-Soviet army that basically collapsed, and Ukrainian army had to emerge like a new voluntary army in 2014 when men and women just went to defend Ukraine with whatever they had. So it's also important to remind that this year we are marking 30 years of the Budapest Memorandum, when Ukraine has given the third largest nuclear arsenal after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1994 in exchange of what is now called security assurances. And that is why I would argue that countries like US, UK, who are co-signatories of this Budapest Memorandum, it also includes Russia that violated this memorandum, have the right to assist Ukraine, have the right to be involved at this high level, because as Ukraine disarmed, they promised security support. But Ukraine, I think it would be a sad development if we have nuclearization going out of control. We don't want that, right? But to be honest, Ukrainians are looking at Israel and they say, well, it's unofficial, but Israel may have a nuclear weapon, and that's why Israel feels more secure, while we feel in the gray zone again. And right now, as everybody pushes Ukraine, it seemed to be, especially President Trump, pushes Ukraine to sit with Russia at the negotiating table, sit with the war criminal, actually, Putin is wanted by the International Criminal Court in the case of forceful deportation of Ukrainian children, 20,000 Ukrainian children. When Ukraine is pushed to negotiate with a war criminal, people in Ukraine are asking Zelensky, how can we guarantee that this deal is worth a paper it is signed on? If we don't get security guarantees from United States, including nuclear umbrella, or from NATO, that includes nuclear umbrella, then maybe we should develop our own nuclear weapon. To be honest, about 25% Ukrainians would agree with that. It's quite a lot of people. Then there is a question of capability, and I do not think Ukraine has immediate capability for some kind of, maybe some small tactical, whatever, nuclear warhead. They can do it, but Ukraine doesn't have its own enriched uranium, and all the necessary things. It has engineers and some manufacturing facilities that could probably do it. So I would say that Zelensky used it on purpose to raise the stakes for Trump. But I can tell you for sure, Ukraine is not trying to develop nuclear weapon. It is actually trying to build a collective security agreement that will work not just for Ukraine, but for Europe more broadly, because Putin, as I said, has objectives not just against Ukraine, but against wider Europe.
Okay, thank you. Well, then, you mentioned a lot of times Donald Trump. Donald administration 2.0 is coming very quickly, and then we can feel it, from all over the world. I think Europe is shaking, and then Northeast Asia is trembling. I think it's a pretty interesting as a observer, for Donald Trump, to do its own domestic politics. Thank you for your excellent lecture, and then your very sophisticated and then detailed explanation on my questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.